YouTube does this weird thing where it'll keep playing while I'm talking. Welcome to Datocracy with our new format, a couple of special guests. Should we just do a quick round of introductions since we haven't, everyone hasn't met before? I'm Ernie. Ernest and I started the Two Ernest podcast. It must be like before the pandemic. So we've been at this in various guises.
Way
And
before.
we started the Datocracy channel about a year and a half ago with our friend Tom. And we're very excited to introduce a couple of new guests who are going to share about some really interesting ways for, I guess, thinking about thinking. Bobby, are you open to just introducing yourself real quick for the audience?
Sure. Delighted to be here. I'm Bobby Fishkin. I have day-to-day over the last 9 years been co-leading through Crowd Doing, which is a venture lab for systems change, theory and practice. I've also worked extensively in collaboration with my dad, James Fishkin, who runs a Center for Deliberative Democracy that's based at Stanford. We've collaborated on multiple deliberative democracy related initiatives, him and Alice Sue and I. So in the deliberative democracy work, what would the people think if they were thinking? How can we understand that? How can we have that informed decision making and collective intelligence? In the broader crowd doing context, how do we get to a solar punk future, or a future that's worth working backwards from? And what are the pathways that we have together to navigate towards such? But delighted to be here, and thank you so much.
Right, and Bobby's latest achievement was introducing me to Daniel. I talked to his dad back in the days when I was doing radical centrist political reform stuff. And I will just turn it over to Daniel to introduce yourself and then go into the topic, and I'll show up again in 20, 30 minutes to ask some follow-up or to moderate the follow-up questions. So go for it.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining. So in terms of the format, I've been asked to first introduce myself and then briefly speak to 3 questions. What is cognitive security? Why is cognitive security a critical skill for navigating the AI-disrupted internet? And how do active inference and the free energy principle help individuals and groups make better decisions? So I'll try to be concise on all 4 accounts and look forward to everyone's questions so we can have that discussion. So as to my personal introduction, currently I'm in California. I'm a researcher. I completed my PhD at Stanford from 2014 to 2019, studying collective behavior and genetics and neurophysiology in ants. I completed my postdoc just a few weeks ago, working on genomics and cognitive modeling, primarily in insects, and also getting more involved in active inference and cognitive security. So, what is cognitive security really? And what is it really? Well, of course, any question about a word can get devolved into any number of ways. So I want to approach this in a few different, more formulaic ways that I think can help scaffold cognitive security, not as a domain out there, but as a stance that we can take right here. So one formula is cognitive security is cognitive science plus security. It's the territory of cognitive science, what would be studied by a cognitive scientist, plus a security stance or security posture. Another way to think about it is it's security in the cognitive domain. What is the cognitive domain? It sounds really abstract or esoteric or ephemeral. Well, no, the cognitive domain is the semantic domain, the domain of meaning, the semiotic domain of meaning making, the narrative domain. Also, importantly, we can just divide cognitive activities across an interface in terms of the inbound dependencies, which we can associate with perception and sense making, and the outbound dependencies, which we can associate with action selection, decision making. So whether we're talking about an API call to a language model, or a text message to your friend, or a crow call in the forest, we can think very generally about cognitive systems in terms of this inbound sense-making dependency and this outbound action selection dependency. So if one has de-risked or secured or gotten to the best possible way of doing sense making and decision making, that doesn't mean the business is going to work. It doesn't mean the bird's going to reproduce. It doesn't mean the paper's going to be accepted, but it means that it was as good as it could have been. Cognitive security applies to humans as well as non-humans. We just briefly spoke about human, non-human animal, and even digital or cyber intelligences. And cognitive security, therefore, helps us grasp these complex assemblages or ecosystems of shared intelligence where we have mixed compositions that include all different kinds of components. And as computing also begins to include things like neuromorphic chips, thermodynamic intelligence, and so on, it will be increasingly important to have frameworks for modeling diverse intelligences and for taking a security posture in those spaces. So, CogSec, to kind of conclude this first question and bridge to the second one, it does draw upon cognitive science, and by taking a security stance, enables it to reach into even the personal. So, why is active inference a critical skill for today, for navigating the internet? Well, using a little trick from active inference, which we'll return to later, let's think about this in terms of a low road and a high road, and they're going to meet in the middle. So all roads are going to lead to CogSec, and there's going to be a low road, which is going to address the how, and a high road, which is going to address like the why, or the kind of top down, the big picture. So in terms of the top down why, what scaffolds the need for there to be practices like CogSec, call it whatever you want, doesn't need to be an English term. What scaffolds it? All the meaning associated with semantics, narrative, all of the consequences of sense making and decision making, which broadly are our very activities. So whatever high road you choose to grapple onto, or whatever moon you point to with your finger, CogSec is going to be like a coefficient that helps protect and address that. As to the low road, again, there's many flavors, and hardly in this conversation, let alone my life, am I the one to dictate what these are. But we can take this stance. Again, it's not just a subject to learn, it's a stance and a frame to take that can help us understand everything from going on a walk with your dogs, like Ernest is doing, to sitting in a relaxing room, hopefully that some of you are doing, to turning off distractions or making sure that your attention can be focused. Why would it matter for there to be high quality attention and focusing? Well, why does the task matter? If the task doesn't matter, then maybe you need to pull back to that meta CogSec to say, maybe this isn't the thing I should be attending to. But within the space of attention and engagement, human to human, across a human machine interface, two synthetic intelligences together, we can pull back again, the incoming perceptual sense making and the outgoing action selection. If those are as good as they can be, what else can a thing really hope for? So CogSec gives us a way to bundle and also unbundle different practices relating to mindfulness, just habits, traditions, folkways, whatever people want to do, whatever people already do. This isn't another activity. It's not a different song to sing necessarily. It's a different understanding and community and scientific grounding in securing the cognitive. So, to the last question, and then we can have a discussion. How do active inference and the free energy principle help individuals and groups make better decisions? This is a very big topic, and we have written and explored this a lot, although only scratch the surface as well. Active inference and free energy principle are like theoretical cognitive physics. Cognitive security is like applied cognitive engineering. So we're building a bridge, just to give a simple construction project example. The metallurgy is about the tensile quality of the steel and about what needs to be brought here and logistics, and there's so much that goes into it. And then in operation, you have people driving on the bridge. So one level of pragmatism for the engineer is like, okay, cool. apart from the metallurgy, which steel are we going to put where? That's one type of structural or systemic cognitive security engineering. And then we can even follow that on through to the runtime where we have people driving on that bridge. What is going to be a safer bridge? Everybody paying attention to driving or texting while driving and so on. And other types of influences that might be variable car to car, variable moment to moment. So not everyone is obsessed with securing bridges, but there are people who are. And not everyone is always anxious all the time about road rage, themselves or others, or about getting in a car crash all the time. But people lock their door when they leave their house. That's physical security. People change their passwords sometimes. That's digital security. And so here is cognitive security. In our cyber-physical environments, the cognitive is the interface of physical-physical, digital-digital, and physical-digital. So across all the interfaces, we're talking about cognitive as a function. Active inference and free energy principle provide like that high-octane theoretical physics grounding that's general to the point of not being applicable. There's so much work to do with taking the first principles of active inference and free energy principle, bringing them into practice. But that's kind of like the theoretical physics to engineering and security continuum, just analogously, loosely. So how do ActInf and FEP help individuals and groups make better decisions? Well, with our colleagues, we talk about this and we implement it every single day. How do you make better decisions with ActInf and FEP or other techniques? I want to know. I don't think that this is a story that's even been partially written. So there's many ways to go, but I just pull back to thinking like cognitive science and security, and somebody can do a really incredible cognitive study in the lab, and that is factual within its constrained variability reduced setting. But in the variability unreduced setting of real life where things get messy, where it's going to rain on that bridge, and if you tested the steel in a dry environment, then the safety properties aren't going to be the same when it's deployed in a rainy environment, maybe. And so that is more of a tension to hold, and a unity is plural and at minimum two to scaffold, not like we're going to collapse engineering into science or collapse science into engineering. So cognitive science is cognitive science. Cognitive security is cognitive security. And by using shared terms and even more than terms, a shared ontology and a shared community and a shared stewardship and a shared systems of interest, we're already in it all together. So that's where I'll close with those short answers.
Great, thank you. That was very concise. So I think I understand cognitive science is the study of minds broadly, which includes human, biological, synthetic, etc. And I understand cognitive security is trying to apply that to, I love that it's a coefficient of how we think. And the more, the better we think, the better everything that we do is, and the worse we think, the worse everything we do is. Could you actually, so one thing that was intriguing to me was these phrases, active inference and the free energy principle. Could you just define them so we understand, like, what are the tools that they add to our metacognition? Like, should I care about those terms at all? And if so, what do they mean for how I make decisions or how we make decisions?
It's a very rich question. I think the footnote alone is it's like a lid on a rabbit hole. So if you want to dig down into the technical literature and come to understand that free energy principle is a variational principle of least action for cognitive things, and then if you want to connect that to active inference and understand that this is a development in cybernetics, and it gives us a unified approach to talk about the sense-making and decision-making of arbitrary entities, if you want to go down that road, please join us at the Active Inference Institute, or just search or consult a language model. But it's kind of like numbers, Like number theory could take up 1,000 lifetimes, but you say, could you bring 6 eggs from the store? And no one says, ooh, I don't know, 6, it sounds like a number. I'm not sure if I could do that. I haven't done number theory. So do not let technical jargon, English or otherwise, impede the security imperative. This is about us in the driver's seat, sense making and action taking. And then if a vision scientist said, oh, well, you think you're looking at art, but actually it's just the retina details. Well, it's a yes and, it's not a yes but. There is a retina, there are photons on the retina, and there is art, and there is the experience of art. So at whatever technical detail level any person is going to reach in their own epistemic foraging, whether you just glide past active inference and say, okay, it's all there in the title, action and inference, learning and action. It's all there in the title. That's all that's needed. No truly need to dig any further. Or if you do want to find out what we are up to in that theoretical cognitive physics side, we have that.
So sorry, let me just as a really summary, just to make sure I got it correctly, is that re-energy's principle is basically saying that we tend to make decisions in a way that is, energy efficient, in that all else being equal, we will choose the least energy way to make a decision. Is that a crude simplification?
I'll say that it tells us that the most likely thing happens, which is the most mystifyingly boring way to put it. Most efficient or the likeliest thing happening, ball rolling down the hill, doesn't mean that you just plop on the floor and die. So sometimes people can confuse least action, a path of least action, a principle of least action, and the computational efficiency benefits of these technologies with thinking, well, then we should be lowering energy use. Suffice to say, we're not talking about thermodynamic free energy. We're talking about informational free energy, information gradients, which are not exactly or necessarily thermal gradients. So the path of least action for the marathon runner at the start line is the marathon. So it's not a laziness principle. It's a things do what they are principle.
Right. Okay. I think I understand, at least for me, that was helpful. And then active inference, is this the idea that we're not just passively running a program that as we act, we change our models and therefore the way that we infer also changes over time? Or is there some other concept there that I'm missing?
Yeah, active inference gives us the Lego toolkit, the composable toolkit to model diverse intelligences. So we could imagine a thermometer that takes in a temperature reading and then does or doesn't turn on an air conditioner. Or that could take in 3 thermometer readings and output
a thermostat. Okay.
Yeah. It could take in thermometer readings and be a thermostat and so on. Or you could be interested in the kind of sophisticated cognitive systems that people are. And so then you might be looking at patterns related to metacognition, to learning, but the commonality is that the generalization enables active engagement with an information environment. So in contrast with an algorithm that, for example, takes a batch of images, does as well, it iterates over them or cuts it up or just looks through it once, and then fits a model based upon the batch of images, drawing on cybernetics and ecological psychology, active inference is about the real-time unfolding engagements across the interface of sense making and action. And so that supports a much more general way to think about cognition.
All right, thank you. That's my Q&A section. And I think we'll slice it up. I think we have enough time. Everyone can take 5 minutes, and you can use that for some time of commenting and some time of asking questions and letting Daniel answer. And I will pick on my friend Rohit first, who just joined us. And since it's his first time on the call, I'll have him go first. We'll kind of go in reverse order of seniority. Rohit, you want to introduce yourself real quick and make any comments or ask a question?
Well, I guess I'll have to. I'm Rohit Khare. I'm just representing myself today at the moment, but I have worked in cloud security for a number of years and around natural language processing and AI as well. And I'm just trying to get my grasp around this concept for the first time. Thanks for including me and joining me. You can find me at PerCogSec.org. And I was just posting in the text chat some links I'd found as well. And right now, my first set of questions weren't so much about the theory, but kind of the usual cheat of any academic would just ask, well, what's the context from which this discussion originated? So I was going to ask a little bit about the history of the term and why it was created, whom it speaks most to, kind of what are the communities that people care about it. I got the immediate impression that it is best understood coming from, maybe not from the cybernetics and systems engineering and computer-supported cooperative work and groupware and decision-making theory, which is one strain of thinking going back from the post-World War II era to modern times. But another strain in the history of technology or the history of science here would be from the militarized world of psychological operations, of understanding people's weak spots, what the Chinese have been calling cognitive warfare, and some of the funding here, while NSF funded, also seems linked to the national security context. I was wondering if either of those hypotheses have any validity to them, or kind of what else would you say about the cultural origin and history of the people who've been interested in the term? Where is this coming from, as opposed to what the idea is, which I'm also want to dig into.
Great. I'll briefly answer this. You're absolutely right that coming from systems engineering, cognitive science, knowledge management, collaboration, cybernetics, touching into the personal is one lineage. And then there are other lineages of people who are interested in the cognitive, ranging from advertisers and manipulators to psychological operations more generally. So certainly those are all different genres or types or histories. And I await future bibliographic analyses to trace those out more fully. To the origin points for PerCogSec.org, for the Cognitive Security and Education Forum, which I work at with RJ Corday, he began CogSec in partial response to a testimony that was presented at the Senate Armed Services Committee, Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, in 2017 by Rand Waltzman, called The Weaponization of Information, the Need for Cognitive Security.
And so in that sense, it also corresponds to both working inside the decision loop, the OODA loop of like an individual, the cognitive warfare, the psychological pressure applied to individual combatants or individual analysts or actors, as well as the population level stuff, which is kind of where this modern and highly politically charged debate about misinformation, accurate information, deception, information operations comes from. So it seems that Rand reference you're getting at is, I'm assuming, in the context of this population level social media manipulation as well. So does it cognitive security? Do you find it on a continuum between individuals, groups, and populations, or are they very different mechanisms?
Great question. So in 2021, with Scott David and RJ, we wrote a paper that connected the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, to the active inference loop. Suffice to say, they're both describing the same territory. We're talking about the person in the fighter jet, or we're talking about the person at a knowledge console, whatever it may be, same territory, different way to model it. And that's a nice connection there. Whether you think about it as a continuum from the neuron and the interface of a neuron and brain regions and the brain body, and then the social and all these nested layers, if you think about it as a continuum or as nesting of like nested systems, hierarchical system of systems, yes, it exists because the observe might be what information comes in to a verified information environment. And then the cognition is what happens in it. And then the action is what comes out. So that could be 3 out of 5 signing a cryptographic signature. It could be a squirrel in a box, picking the left arm or the right arm. You don't know what's on the other side of the interface. That is that fundamental cognitive science, but really cognitive physics axiom, which is we're going to start with boundaries and talk about sense making and perception across boundaries. And that is where the science allows us to have continuity across the neuron to the society in description, because everyone agrees that they're like attached, they're part of the same turf. But how do we move beyond it just being a metaphor? Oh, it's like this group is making a decision, or it's like this brain region has an overconfidence bias, or it's like this country is having this cognitive phenomena. We even use the linguistics of personalization to talk about what this company wants or what they thought would have happened. And this gives actually some legitimation instrumentally to using those kinds of cognitive language.
Great. So in that
All
kind
right, I'm gonna transition now. Thank you very much for those great questions, Rohan. I wanted to give Bobby the floor.
Thank you,
If you have any
Ernie.
comments or questions.
And thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing. I'm always inspired by the way you have contextualized active inference and cognitive security in these fields that I've learned about so much in the way you frame them. Thank you. I wanted to ask and think a little bit on a few threads that you shared. So one of the threads that came up, I think, is context variation by design. Wouter's context, I think, intersects this in the sense that we can choose what meaning we make from what context. And the other layer of that I should reflect is that knowledge democracy, the idea that we can integrate multiple epistemologies into one format of sense making, also feels like a kindred field in some sense to where I was hearing the contextuality across disciplinary lines. And this brings me to this idea that comes out of the other bailiwicks that you have in context in regards to this, which is that requisite variety of interdisciplinary diversity for sense making, collective sense making, individual sense making, coordinated sense making, by sector, by contextuality. It seems like AI as large language model context for simulating interdisciplinary diversity that we lack in any given room is a really marvelous meta cognitive security active inference integration point. The other layers I was going to weave, and then I can hand back to you, Daniel, for your own weave accordingly, is thinking about what you shared in active inference as a form of antidote to single disciplinary solipsism. So if people are stuck in their discipline and they're vulnerable to the cognitive insecurity of interdisciplinary myopia, then maybe cognitive security, awareness of the intersection between all the fields they don't know and the fields they need to know in order to be agentic feels like a way to navigate. So I also wanted to just flag from where you were going that I hear about the idea of a cost of inaction scenario and this distinction between prognostication that is predictive and what will happen without our action, cost of inaction scenario, versus what wonderful thing could happen if we act differently. And I think of that as a regenerative shadow or a solar punk twin for the world. How do we have our cognitive security be as much catastrophic risk successful avoidance as transformational regenerative opportunity, discovery, sense making in real time? I think about the recent announcements of AI literally watching as you see the thing unfolding. And I think about that, yes, there's a risk layer, mitigation of that, but the idea of positive risk or opportunity management that is a trillion more opportunities across a lifetime than people embrace that would serve their interests in ways we cannot today anticipate fully. I think that there's a really interesting sort of cognitive security, opportunity management, transformational agency, solar punkification of the universe aligned. Our friend David Hodgson changed his LinkedIn bio to solar punkifying the universe. So I will cite that in saying, in the spirit of solar punkifying the universe, let me hand back to Daniel.
Thank you, Bobby. A lot of great pieces there. I love this idea of like kind of like a racing game. Like you're on the bike, but then there's this ghost or a shadow that might be you if you had just thrown the handlebars to the side and crashed. But it's also like a ghost that could be better. And that actually speaks to the technical definition of risk statistically. People talk about risk as being like the probability that a negative thing happens. Like it's a risky road, there's a danger. However, statistically, risk from a control theory setting is uncertainty associated with a policy choice. So a risky investment isn't one where you lose your money. A risky investment is one that has a wide uncertainty interval. They might all be positive. Whereas a not risky investment, it doesn't mean you're going to make money. Doesn't mean you're going to keep the money. In fact, you might confidently lose all the money. That's a low risk investment. Again, being a little cheeky with how we use these technical and non-technical terms, but it speaks to this idea that, yeah, variability includes upside. It's not only about like keeping things sterile. And so that's this kind of fun element. You spoke about disciplinarity and multi and post-disciplinarity. Nature is not broken up by discipline. If people who are interested in the stewardship of that bridge came with, okay, well, I'm only interested in plastic. Okay, I'm only interested in metal. I'm only interested in this. It would be like all the doctors coming together with a single organ focus, and the health of the whole would suffer for that. So security is basically like saying, whatever you care about, it's not broken up by discipline. And if we put the lead on what we care about and the unbroken, unmistaken nature of what we care about, like carpal tunnel security, well, then that includes the behavioral and maybe a little of this and a little bit of that, but it all comes back to and weaves together with the integrity of an actual thing that defies the kind of organizational defined disciplinaries that we see. And then just last comment, which I think connects Bobby and Rohit, what you added. In cybersecurity, a lot of this is found in the area of human factors. And so I kind of hyperbolically think about a situation where it's like the physical security team says, hey, the building wasn't broken into. And the data security team says, well, the password wasn't cracked. We weren't decrypted. But what happens when the person makes a mistake? In the sense making as manifest through action. That's cognitive security. So let's keep the building secure. Let's keep the data secure. But that's the beginning of the conversation on semantic integrity and narrative and belonging and all these things that are never going to be accomplished with a thicker door or more cryptography.
That was great, Daniel. Thank you. Now pitching it to Tom.
Yeah. Okay. We have an awful lot of commonality, I sense, in words, but Daniel, I have problems understanding where you're going, in the sense of I hear a whole lot of concerns that I agree with, like systems thinking, to take an example, and sound decision making, but I don't get anything to get my hands on and do. But maybe maybe that's something that just takes time or more reading. I threw into the chat in the theme of decision making some links to things I've written. If anybody wants to figure out how I think, I'll try. I believe that decisions have to be made in a systems environment, Daniel. So I know you're there, considering all the factors. And I believe that they have to be made with respect to multiple considerations simultaneously, multiple objectives and constraints. In other words, we have to, and I haven't heard that word from you guys yet, multidimensional thinking, but it's big for me. Okay. I'll leave it there for the moment, see what happens.
Yes,
Okay.
indeed. We can model cognitive systems that have multiple constraints, arbitrary dimensionality of constraints. For example, blood sugar, pH, temperature, and so on. It's not good enough to be homeostatic on 2 of the 3 and let the third one fly. The organism dies. So there are sophisticated cognitive modeling approaches to arbitrarily nested, arbitrary dimension models. That's the science. Whereas the practice is working using pattern languages, requirements engineering, stakeholder input, all these different practices that are no different than what's already happening. So what do you want in your hands? If it's a pen, if it's a keyboard, start there. And you're already there. Hence, trying to position it, honestly, how I see it, as a posture rather than a field over there. It's like a position we can put our body and our mind in, like triple threat. But it's not any other physical object. It's not another term. It doesn't even need the term itself. For example, digital mindfulness, if that's the flavor, then that's what it is. And so it can be on the science side as many flights of fancy as we want. On the security side, as many pragmatic flights as we can take.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. And yes, I really appreciate your putting yourself out there and agreeing to make this live recording to help us move the conversation forward. So last but certainly not least, my co-pilot Ernest will have his 5 minutes. After that, this is the fishbowl format I developed with our friends at the Center for Public Philosophy at University of Santa Cruz. We'll give you a few minutes at the end to sort of reflect on what you've learned or what you found interesting about the dialogue and the questions, Daniel. And then what I'd like to do is maybe just take everyone to do maybe in the chat or maybe 30 seconds. What would be the premise of Datocracy is this idea of how do we use the way we think about data to improve human flourishing at writ large, politics, systems, technology, et cetera. And so maybe just have it, I'll just hit the fact we want to talk about like, okay, where do we go next? What's the practical thing based on, what we've learned today, as well as everything else we've been thinking about? What are the interesting questions we can ask? So, but that's just a teaser. I will let Ernest have his 5 minutes and then Daniel can respond.
Thank you, Ernest. And thank you, Daniel, for your presentation. As you were speaking and talking and sharing your knowledge, my point of view is always community. How do we help 3 people or more make decisions and share knowledge? And that's my main interest. What have you, other than the modeling knowledge and modeling language and these things that you're talking about, how do you see the making it easy for people of several, of all ages and maturity levels to leverage your work? So how does this work impact a 15-year-old versus 35-year-old based on the knowledge that such people have at their respective ages? And how do you make it easy for people to share knowledge practically in ways that they can accomplish things and make decisions that everybody's involved with? That it's not just one person or 2 people, but the entire group feels like they make a decision together. Is that clear?
Thank you, Ernest. Well, I appreciate this, and I savor what you asked as an opening and an invitation that can't and won't be addressed in 2 minutes. I can speak from my own position as a researcher in just this one chair. We're building the kinds of knowledge systems that allow us to compose patterns and requirements together in new and different ways. That's our developmental work, which if people want to collaborate on the technical components, we welcome this. But what does that kind of a system enable? Well, there are books that will never be published or written, like in X language at Y location in the Z weather condition, what is going to be best for your CogSec? That book will not be published, and if it were printed and shipped to that location, it would go out of date and it wouldn't be read. So using recomposable frameworks for cognitive patterns, we're already developing repertoires of evaluative criteria and remedies. People don't need to go to the technical deep end to understand the details of how we engineer those systems, but they are open source. Remedies can be proposed for different scenarios. The door is unlocked, lock the door. You don't say, oh, we'll come take a 4-year locksmith class. Here's a situation, here's a practice. those kinds of renderable, customized artifacts can come into play. So that's a kind of technological development vector that we're very active on, is new kinds of technologies that recompose what we already understand. However, even without and before and beyond any technical approach, like, I welcome and invite so many ways that people take the terms or just the resonances into their own space. Cognitive security is almost a synonym for psychological safety. I mean, safety and security are synonyms, essentially. Psychological is very close to cognitive. Cognitive is more general. Psychological focuses on the slightly different aspect, arose from human setting. So I don't know. Maybe people come into a room and they say, okay, the door's closed. The data are secure. How can we show up with our full, holistic honesty and be from there? There's just truly an infinite number of settings. And it's some early days for the awareness of that diversity. But human intuition and intelligence and folkways is a tapestry. With metacognition and new tools, we can weave differently and understand how weaving has happened.
Right. You want a quick follow-up, Ernest, or should we leave it there?
We can leave it there. Thank you.
All right, great. So speaking of ways for groups to do decisions together, I'm going to put a question in the chat, which is, what is the most urgent and relevant question you have coming out of today's session as possible fodder for next time? So the goal in the next 15 minutes is to kind of capture some of the learnings and think about what would we like to discuss next time. It could be a question for Daniel. It could be a question about CogSec in general. It could be something else that was triggered by this format or this community or whatever. And I'm going to suggest we actually just take a minute of silence for us to reflect on those questions. And then also give Daniel the floor to kind of open and share his reflections on this process as sharing. And then maybe if we have time, I'll have everyone to take a minute to kind of pitch the thing that they're most curious about for next time. And then let's see if we can converge before the hour ends. So I'll just put 1 minute on the clock. I'm going to mute. You can all mute and then unmute when you're done. And you can also write in the chat if you like. People need 30 seconds. Daniel, whenever you're ready, you can unmute and share.
Thank you. Well, I very much appreciated it. The audio visual is only the tip of the iceberg. Here's my question. Given all of these properties, processes, and perspectives that we've taken on cognitive security today, from the scientific to the professional to the subject and object of care. How can we stay with this beautiful complexity so that we are inspired, vigilant, and effective, not daunted or confused?
All right. Ernest?
Thank you. Well, I had it and it went away.
Okay. You want
But
to pass and we'll come back to you?
yes.
All right. Bobby, you want to share the answer that you had in the chat or an elaboration thereof?
Sure. I have this curiosity, interest in the existence of interest in maybe the manifestability of or feasibility of this idea that came to mind in the discussion of an interdisciplinary myopia self-awareness engine for cognitive security upgrade of reality. And if we were to have that, it would seem that we would know the implications of what we didn't know for what we needed to know in order to navigate life and reality individually and collectively, and that would behoove us. So I thought I'd share that in resonance and synchronicity. Thank you so much, Daniel, for everything you've shared, and thank you all so much for this conversation today.
Great. And let me pitch it to Tom. I know this is putting you on the spot, but could you think of a concrete framing for next month's call that might address your concern? You can restate your concern as well, but I'm also curious if you could talk about what might satisfy the concern.
Yeah, I need less flowery, nice sounding words with which I resonate, and more practical example of here's a problem we solved, decisions we made, tools we use. Much more detailed, practical is my bent. But I'm interested in the area.
I want to respond directly, but I won't. I hope we continue the conversation.
Yeah, and I'll say my part, and then we can kind of riff on this bit. Like, I feel like there's some really rich things going on here as my dogs are jumping on my couch and violating my cognitive security and my physical security. Could we do I guess that's the thing, is I would love to do a case study next time, and we can, maybe have Daniel, depending on his time and availability, frame up some of it using some of the concepts and practices he has. It could be something from his personal experience. It could be something from our overarching mandate of trying to improve civil discourse. But that's the thing that I would love to see is how can we start not just talking about this, but actually proving it out in practice in some pseudo real world setting. Maybe just turn it back to you, Daniel, for any thoughts and reactions you have or suggestions.
I'm thinking of Daniel Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, which some people have critiqued as consciousness explained away. So I'm not going to take a stance on that. But it's like, where's the physical security in this building? Well, that's just a lock. And that's just an appropriately designed door. And that's just a protocol sheet. Physical security is nowhere to be found. And so cognitive security, as I think Tom's question is getting at, I am feeling more than ever this explained versus explained away, because our referent, what we're pointing at, is the world. We're not pointing to another thing. This is the finger in the mirror, or the finger curved back, such that we are addressing the actual with no remainder, including our imagination. And so this is helping me understand some ways to position our empirical and pragmatic work, which we are years down the road on, much of it open source, and how I can do better and engage differently to support some of these understandings in any and all audiences.
Yeah, thank you. So here's Bobby, can I nickname your interdisciplinary myopia self-awareness engine for cognitive security upgrade of reality, a bubble buster? Is that a reasonable catchphrase? Like popping our cognitive or academic bubbles?
Yeah, but I guess if I think about a bubble busted, I don't think of someone as
Burster.
having achieved cognitive security. When I think of the explosive metaphor, right? Like, I guess like agency would be like imagine all of the world's right experts from throughout human history right alongside of you at every moment in time, as and when you need them, in what combination, so that you are living a Habermasian ideal speech situation in situational awareness contextuality for your agency and solar funkification of the universe, right? Like that's sort of the directionality. So bubble busting.
Bursting, but yeah. How about consciousness expander?
That's interesting. What do you think, Daniel?
At least as a
On
short
my
handle.
scientific hand in my toolkit, in my desk over here, we got the expander, we got the contractor, the buster, the inflator, we got the memer, we got the storyteller, we have all the tools. And then engineering is the art and the science of the actual. And that is where you don't want to bust what you don't want to bust. You don't want to inflate what you don't want to inflate. And so that is where we're building the library, the toolkit, and the kind of platonic, essential scientific apparatus to support cognitive security. And in the moment, it is going to look different than science.
Yeah. So here's okay. Here's a thought. What if we picked a real world problem that is often viewed from a narrow disciplinary lens, and then see if we can have a coherent group discussion about it, employing some of these concepts and practices? And the most painful one I can imagine right now for me is the Israeli-Hamas conflict, which God knows where it'll be a month from now. But I have experienced personally this idea of cognitive blowout, where I can have empathy for the Israelis and then I cannot think about Hamas, or I have empathy for the Palestinians and I can't think about Israel. And I don't know how to actually absorb the information in there in a way that helps me make sense. That might be too live. I'm open to counter proposals. We can also do it privately if that's too painful to do as a public thing. I'm just sharing my epistemic limits.
You interpreted the conversation how you interpret it. You said what you wanted to say. I couldn't ask for anything different than that.
Ernest, any thoughts?
As to the original question, to have a question for the next meeting. I was thinking of these videos explaining whatever to a high school student, a college student, a professional, and maybe an older person that are quite interesting. One is even I saw one about explaining quantum computing to a teenager, and then observing the different levels of knowledge and practicality was interesting. So maybe we that's one thing. Like, how can we narrow this field to apply to young people, to middle-aged people, and to older people, so that we bring everybody together?
Thank you, Ernest. And I'm very excited about generative and synthetic intelligence, because we can take the knowledge base and say, for these 50 languages, make 1, 3, and 5-minute videos to these 100 different profiles. And we can generate a first draft or a good enough draft for every length, every topic, every cognitive phenomena. And we've done major work towards that.
Cool.
You want to try politics? Is that any less painful than war these days as a topic for the future, Bobby?
I don't know if Daniel, Daniel, what would be the version if Ernest comment earlier of democratizing this for a college student or democratizing this for a
Yeah.
high school graduate or is there a use case like that that you think could be illustrative? Because that feels like it would be a lot more
Well, how
accessible.
about this one,
Accessibility
actually? This is actually, I think, analogous to that and very pertinent. We are a small group of activists who are concerned about the political dysfunction of America. And we are trying to find out how to, A, help ourselves think more clearly about the problem, and B, help the larger world think more clearly about this. We're not telling people what to think, but we would like to model how to think. Do you think you could come up with
Polarization, Ernie, is what you're thinking? Like how to apply cognitive security to the challenge of polarization in American society?
Polarization, to me, is a symptom of a sort of cognitive dissolution, what I think Venkatesh Rao calls a perma-weird. So I don't necessarily want to limit it to polarization.
Yes, I hear you on this. Different projects for different settings. There's sketch a bridge, build a toothpick model, build a computer model, and do it in the real spot. So the real world is the real world, and I encourage that for political or geopolitical considerations, that the do consideration is brought and it's approached respectfully, because these are very complex situations and they're being recorded on digital materials. That being said, I find that the most interesting scenarios would be like, how about getting a first apartment and talking to a landlord? How about emailing with a professor? It's no different. We're not thinking of bizarre scenarios. We can do some techniques as cognitive security professionals that aren't mimicking what somebody would do in emailing with a professor. For example, I might approach that as a researcher by using our Atlas pattern language and sampling a diversity of colleagues so that we've exhausted or at least saturated the space of patterns and genres so that we could have that toolkit and all the different ways we could respond to the professor and let it sit till tomorrow and run it through GPT and ask a friend and all these different techniques and tools and procedures. We can develop that as researchers, but in the last mile, that doesn't mean that the person writing the email to the professor is going to be using a recomposable pattern language with this kind of awareness, but we are developing with open source the real words, the real concepts, the real practices, something that maps to the real world without remainder.
All right, so I have, so just to wrap it up here, I have a sweet spot or a soft spot for pattern languages. How about we do this thing next week where you take 15, 20 minutes to kind of introduce us to the Atlas pattern language and maybe your top 10 favorite patterns. And then maybe each of us tries out using some of those patterns on problems we care about, whether they're micro or macro. Does that sound like a plan? Would you be up for that, Daniel?
I don't know about the times, we will email, but I'm interested for people to learn and apply Atlas.
All right, and maybe that'll at least get us closer to Tom's request for a concrete use case, even if we're not all the way there yet. All right, it is a time, we're already losing people. Thank you again, Daniel. Thank you for everyone who watched and for everyone who participated, and we will exchange emails and do this again sometime in January. See you in 2024.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.